you've always been a voracious reader, in fact, intimidatingly so. What have you read in the last few years that you think are pointing to new directions in looking at agrarian change, the way in which, in the broadest possible sense?
Well, that's a very reasonable question. My answer is somewhat hampered by my faulty memory, or at least not so much memory as ability to conjure up names and texts and so on. As I mentioned to you before, somebody pointed out that somebody I knew well and interacted with a lot had hardly forgotten anything he'd ever read in 40 or 50 years, and my response was, well, I can't remember half the things I've written, let alone what others have written. But I think I do read very widely, so I don't currently perhaps read as much on agrarian studies as I did at one time. The book I've read recently that most impressed me was Maurice Godelier's Elementary Structures of Kinship, which kind of fed into other things I'm thinking about. But I think in terms of agrarian studies, I think types of work, theoretically informed empirical research on how dynamics and then, of course, outcomes of agrarian change are shifting in current conditions. I think there's a lot coming out from India that interests me. It seems to me that after the great generation, as it were, Utsa Patnaik and others, and Utsa, of course, is still firing on all cylinders, but another generation, I think the debate has opened up in some ways. So while there is still concern with the class dimensions of processes of change in Indian farming, they're not as restrictive or narrowly focused as before. And I think one of the biggest themes for India and elsewhere, of course, is one I touched on briefly, and which I think people are now actually researching as a theme in itself, is those rural-urban connections. Very interesting debates about this in relation to China that I've been following and even commenting on a bit, because China, you have 150 million migrant workers from the countryside in cities, and you also have 150 million, roughly speaking, rural people who work primarily outside agriculture, in local industries and services and so on. And Jan Douwe van der Ploeg, who I mentioned earlier, and my good friend Ye Jingzhong have been arguing that all this outside work and the earnings, the remittances, the savings and so on are driven by a desire to reproduce the family farm, which I just can't buy. I'm not convinced by that at all. So I think, yes, rural-urban connections of different kinds, which are, of course, class-inflected, class-shaped in many ways, as much of the literature on India shows. And it happens to produce kinds of effects in farming in the countryside, which are not linear, although I don't think anybody, any Marxist agrarian political economist should have a fixed notion of linear changes. So land-owning families, which have now basically resettled to urban areas, moved into the professions, moved into business, but retain their land holdings, which are then often leased out to land-hungry farmers, or perhaps even aspiring accumulators, you know, in the areas, in the villages that they came from. I think another massively important area, of course, is ecology. I mean, I think, and I've remarked on this before, the two key dimensions of social science as well as wider political concern that were missing from the founding moment of the Journal of Peasant Studies, which you asked me about a long time ago, were ecology and gender relations. Yes. Those were the two big, and of course there's a lot of very important, very interesting work being done on gender relations and how that impacts on the agenda of agrarian studies. One of the people who I always read with very great attention and concentration, also a friend, is Bridget O'Loughlin, because it's not just that she's a feminist, she's actually a Marxist feminist, a materialist feminist, and that is a somewhat rarer breed altogether. So otherwise I read very widely and promiscuously. I have been reading a book of a thesis on India by somebody you know, whose name again has escaped me, a book on caste and class in Politics of the Poor, again coming from a somewhat different direction, but I think it takes class quite seriously, and it looks at class in relation to caste, which you have to do in India otherwise. Yeah, and I think again that's other forms of social division, social oppression, enriching class analysis so that it connects with, incorporates other forms of division and oppression is massively important. It is said that caste was long neglected on the Indian left. I think that's no longer the case. There's work by Jens and Alpashar at LSE and their collaborators trying to grapple with that. So I think also I would say that without going the whole distance and buying into intersectionality, yes, which is, I think, considered sympathetically but with useful criticism by David McNally, sure, for example, in a recent book. And gender, well, the whole area of social reproduction and how it functions. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Henry Bernstein. It has been a pleasure.
Thanks, Subir.